The morning light fractured perfectly across the marble floor of Sterling Tower. Inside, the shareholders gathered, raising crystal glasses to celebrate a new era of dominance. At the center of it all stood Evelyn Croft. 32, sharp, and dressed in flawless designer armor. She commanded the room with practiced ease. Her smile was bright, but it never quite reached her eyes. To Evelyn, this pristine environment was a fortress she had built against a bitter past. Every detail had to be perfect. The division's reputation, and her own, balanced on the razor's edge of absolute visual perfection. Then, the heavy glass doors swung open. The orchestrated elegance of the lobby shattered as a man stepped off the busy street and into the frame. He was rugged, 40-something, wearing a frayed flannel shirt and dust-covered work boots. Under his arm, he carried a battered leather drafting case. This was Julian Vance. His steady gaze swept across the opulent hall, unaffected by the sudden silence that rippled through the crowd of tailored suits. Investors turned their heads, whispers spreading like a sudden chill. A maintenance worker, they assumed, hopelessly lost in the wrong wing of the building. Evelyn saw the boots first. The dirt against her pristine floor. A cold panic tightened in her chest, the deep-seated fear of anything unrefined staining her world. She detached herself from the investors, her heels clicking rapidly across the marble. She moved to intercept the disruption before it could spread any further. "People like you don't belong here," her voice echoed, smooth and chillingly final. "The service entrance is around the back." Julian looked at her. There was no flash of anger, only the quiet observation of a man who had heard it all before. He gave a single, slight nod, the kind of nod a man gives when a sad truth confirms itself, and turned toward the side corridor. The heavy drafting case remained tucked under his arm. The lobby let out a collective breath, the disruption seemingly handled. Evelyn pivoted back to the investors, summoning her practiced, luminous smile, ready to seamlessly recover the morning's perfection. Then, a soft chime interrupted the murmurs. The brass doors of the private elevator at the far end of the hall slid open. Arthur Sterling stepped out. At 72, the chairman leaned on a polished oak cane, using it more for emphasis than support. The room immediately rearranged itself around him. Whispers died instantly. This was the gravitational pull of old, established power. Investors straightened their ties. Evelyn and her senior executives instinctively stepped forward, eager to offer their practiced greetings. But the chairman did not stop for them. He walked straight past the cameras, past Evelyn entirely, his eyes locked on the man in flannel. The chairman bypassed the receiving line entirely, his cane clicking a steady rhythm toward the side corridor. Evelyn stood frozen, her outstretched hand dropping slowly to her side as the room watched in absolute, breathless silence. "Julian," Arthur's voice resonated through the vast hall, carrying an unmistakable weight of authority and warmth. At the edge of the corridor, the man in the flannel shirt stopped. He turned slowly, the worn drafting case still under his arm. Arthur closed the distance. He did not offer a brisk corporate handshake, but took Julian's hand firmly in both of his own. "My God, it's been too long," Arthur said, his tone shifting from a commanding chairman to an old, relieved friend. The chairman then turned slightly, ensuring his voice reached every corner. "I am deeply sorry you had to walk into your own building through the back." The words landed like heavy stones. The elite crowd exchanged frantic, confused glances, struggling to comprehend the situation. Arthur placed a hand on Julian's shoulder. "This man designed the very tower you are all standing in." The pristine smile on Evelyn's face fractured. Her carefully constructed armor cracked as the devastating reality of her mistake settled in. "I have been trying to bring him back to this company for 10 years, Arthur declared, his voice echoing in the absolute stillness. No one dared to speak. The heavy gaze of the investors slowly shifted from the chairman to the young CEO. Julian could have used the moment. The room would have forgiven him anything, would have gladly watched him humiliate the woman who had just dismissed him. Instead, he simply shook Arthur's hand once more and set his worn leather case on the nearest marble reception desk. He stepped back, quietly declining to be a weapon. His silence was far heavier than any retaliation could have been. But the damage was already done. Evelyn felt the subtle shift in the room. The investors no longer looked at her with awe, but with thinly veiled doubt. She finished the morning signing through a thick mental fog, forcing a rigid smile for the flashing cameras.
Just one more to the left.
Hours later, the grand lobby finally emptied. Evelyn walked toward the elevators, her sharp footsteps now sounding hollow and isolated. She retreated to her top-floor office, shutting the heavy mahogany doors to block out the world. Standing alone at the expansive glass, she looked down at the harbor, terrified by the realization that her carefully curated identity was suddenly unraveling. Evelyn sat at her sprawling mahogany desk, the silence of the penthouse pressing heavily against her as she opened her laptop. She rarely allowed herself to look backward, but she needed to understand the man she had just dismissed. She typed Julian's name into the archives. The search results were instantaneous and overwhelming. Julian Vance was not a mere employee. Old industry articles called him a once-in-a-generation talent. The screen illuminated her face with old photographs, a younger, clean-shaven Julian, standing confidently on stages, accepting prestigious design awards. In almost every picture, he stood beside a beautiful woman. Her smile was warm, grounding his brilliance in something deeply human. Then, the timeline stopped abruptly. Evelyn read a brief, factual notice detailing the woman's sudden, tragic departure from the world. What followed in the record was absolute silence. A celebrated architect had simply vanished, trading a name everyone wanted for a life no one noticed. Evelyn leaned back in her leather chair, the glow of the screen reflecting in her widened eyes. The realization made her feel physically ill. She had stood in a marble lobby and weighed the value of a human being entirely by the dirt on his boots. With terrifying clarity, Evelyn understood that she had become exactly the kind of person who used to make her feel utterly worthless. She had a choice. She could let the incident fade, blaming the chaos of the morning and the unannounced arrival. Her chief operating officer, Marcus Thorne, had already begun to frame it that way. He stood in her doorway, murmuring reassurances. He insisted that no one of consequence would remember it by next quarter, that a CEO could not be expected to recognize every face. The corporate mask was still there, waiting for her to put it back on. But Evelyn found she no longer wanted to wear it. For 2 days, she did nothing, and the inaction felt like a slow suffocation. On the third morning, she cancelled her entire schedule. She didn't tell Marcus where she was going. She knew he would want the situation managed, and she needed to do this herself. She drove to the historic harbor district, leaving the pristine glass of the financial sector behind for salt-stained brick and cobblestone. She found his print shop by the address, a narrow, worn storefront with a hand-painted sign and a dim front window. A woman who had clawed her way out of a place like this should have felt superior standing before it. Instead, she felt entirely exposed. Pulling her expensive coat tighter around her, Evelyn reached out and pushed the heavy wooden door open. The interior of the shop was small and bright, smelling faintly of ink and aged paper. Julian stood at a wide wooden table in the center of the room, his sleeves rolled up, hands resting flat against a vast sheet of drawings. At the chime of the bell, he looked up. He recognized her instantly, yet his expression registered no surprise whatsoever. He did not offer her a chair, nor did he offer a greeting. He simply waited with unhurried calm, letting the silence force her hand. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice stripped entirely of its usual boardroom command. "I came to apologize," she said. "What I said to you in the lobby.
I deeply regret
I was
everything
deeply
I've
wrong.
done.
I didn't know who you were.
I'm truly sorry.
Julian studied her for a moment. When he spoke, his tone held no edge, no anger, only absolute clarity. That's the part that doesn't matter. You didn't know who I was, he continued quietly. You decided I was no one worth being kind to. He held her gaze, unwavering. Those aren't the same mistake. The words went into her cleanly, the way only true things do. His profound stillness left her nothing to push against but her own guilt. She had no rehearsed reply. She stood in the dusty, sunlit shop, a powerful CEO in a coat worth more than the table he worked on. For the first time since taking the chair, she let herself feel the simple fact that she had hurt someone and had nothing to offer but the truth. You're right, she said finally, her voice steady despite the vulnerability. It isn't the same mistake. And I am not asking you to forgive the second one.
I won't apologize.
I just needed you to know that I see the difference now. Julian studied her for a long moment. The rigid distance between them seemed to thin in the quiet space of the shop. Something in his expression shifted, not warmth, exactly, but the first small acknowledgement that she might be more than the arrogant woman from the lobby. He did not tell her it was all right, because it was not. But he gave her a single, definitive nod. This time, the gesture did not mean an ending, but something closer to a beginning. Evelyn turned and left the shop without another word. Outside, the harbor light fell with a tired, golden quality across the cobblestone and the water. She had walked in certain of her absolute power, and walked out stripped of the false story she told about herself, finally breathing the unfamiliar air of honesty. The apology did not settle anything, which was the first thing that surprised Evelyn. Instead, it sat heavily in her chest, refusing to be filed away. Julian, for his part, returned to his drawings. He assumed the chapter had closed. He had built his quiet life specifically to avoid people in glass towers. He was wrong. A week after the incident, a sleek black town car pulled up to the cobblestone curb outside the print shop. Arthur Sterling entered the dusty storefront himself. The chairman lowered himself onto the only spare wooden stool and set his cane against the table. He told Julian what he wanted. The city had finally approved the renovation of the historic harbor district, and Sterling Dominion had won the contract. I have plenty of architects, Arthur said. What I don't have is someone who will fight to keep the place human. Julian looked at the old man. The harbor meant something profound to him. It was where he and his late wife had spent their earliest, happiest years. Arthur had found the one project Julian could not entirely refuse. I'll do it, Julian said at last, on two conditions. I don't appear in any of it. No press, no photographs. And I stay out of whatever politics happen inside your company. Arthur agreed without hesitation. The two men shook hands for a second time, far from any cameras or boardrooms. What neither man said aloud, though both understood perfectly, was that the massive harbor renovation fell entirely under the Southern Division. This meant Julian would be working every single day with the very woman who had told him he did not belong. Evelyn received the news via a formal memo from the chairman's office, bypassing her own chief operating officer entirely. She read the document in her quiet penthouse. Julian Vance was appointed senior design advisor, reporting directly to her. The arrangement was almost unbearable in its symmetry. She could not refuse the partnership without exposing the guilt she was trying to bury. A week later, they stood inside a converted waterfront field office, surrounded by fresh surveys, renderings, and the smell of salt water. Their first meetings were stiff and careful. They kept a wide physical distance, speaking strictly of concrete, steel, and permits. Julian proved to be precise, demanding, and utterly without flattery. He treated her authority with polite indifference. He rejected the firm's first 3 commercial concepts outright, calmly crossing out expensive designs that erased the harbor's history. Evelyn had expected to resent him. Instead, she found herself agreeing with his vision before she could even defend her own team's work. Back in the towering glass boardrooms, Evelyn had always ruled through speed and absolute, aggressive certainty. She had learned early on never to let a silence sit long enough for anyone to question her authority.
And I expect execution, not excuses.
Julian was entirely immune to all of it. When she pushed, he simply let the heavy silences sit. He answered her sharpest, most rapid-fire demands with slower, far more profound questions about the project's true purpose. Working beside him day after day exposed to Evelyn just how little of her own authority was built on actual substance. Slowly, and against every self-preserving instinct she had developed, she began to desperately want his good opinion. That simple, quiet desire frightened her more than any hostile board of investors ever had. As the weeks turned into months, the tension between them shifted. It was no longer strictly professional, though neither dared to name it. Late at night, working alone in the dimly lit field office, a heavy, unspoken awareness filled the space between them. It was the strange, crackling charge of two highly guarded people slowly circling the exact same problem. The work pushed them closer, whether they wished it or not. One night, they stayed late, arguing over the central dilemma of the project. Evelyn defended the investors' demand for exclusivity. Julian fought to keep the old warehouses entirely open to the public. "I owe them what every building owes the people who walk past it," Julian said. "The chance to feel like they belong." He looked at her sharp designer clothes. "I thought you'd understand that. You didn't always have a coat like that." The remark was not meant to be cruel, but it found a hidden nerve. Evelyn's polished surface finally cracked. "No," she said softly, staring down at the blueprints. "I didn't." And then, without quite deciding to, she told him the truth. She spoke of a childhood spent in places far worse than the harbor. She spoke of a mother who cleaned wealthy people's houses, and the deep, burning shame of always wearing the wrong clothes. "They looked through me like I was furniture," she whispered, her voice completely stripped of its corporate armor. "So I learned to look first." Inside, the walls were finally coming down. But outside, in the dark parking lot, Chief Operating Officer Marcus Thorne was patiently watching. "I became exactly the kind of person who used to make me feel like nothing," Evelyn confessed, the shame heavy in her voice. She rested her hands flat on the drafting table. "I just did it from the other side of the room." The office remained completely quiet. Julian did not reach for comfort, because they both knew empty comfort would have been a lie. "People who get hurt badly enough," he said gently, "usually turn into the exact thing that hurt them.
It wasn't your fault.
The cruelty doesn't just disappear. It looks for somewhere new to live, and the easiest place is your own hands." The words settled over her. The strange, profound relief of being completely seen almost undid her. Julian saw it, too. He finally understood that her icy exterior was not an absence of feeling, but a massive wall built around too much of it. In that quiet moment, he stopped seeing the arrogant CEO from the lobby, and finally saw the frightened survivor underneath. What neither of them knew was how this fragile honesty looked through the telephoto lens of Marcus Thorne. In the photographs he captured from the dark, their shared vulnerability looked exactly like a secret, illicit romance. He finally had his weapon. Later that night, Marcus Thorne sat alone in his darkened office, meticulously reviewing the digital files. He understood immediately the immense power of what he held. It did not matter what had actually passed between them. A heartfelt confession of childhood poverty would mean absolutely nothing to a board of wealthy directors. But clear, sharp images of the division's CEO alone at night with a project advisor, that spoke a language they understood perfectly. It was the undeniable language of scandal. Marcus began to build his case, his fingers tapping methodically across his keyboard. He drafted a formal complaint, framing himself as a reluctant senior officer forced to act to protect the company's fragile reputation. For months, he had patiently taught Evelyn how to weaponize her public image against her rivals. Now, with a cold, calculating smile, he prepared to use image to completely destroy her. Completely unaware of the trap closing around her, Evelyn arrived at Sterling Tower early the next morning. But as she walked through the grand lobby, something fundamental had changed. She no longer wore her arrogance like a shield. For the first time in years, Evelyn offered a genuine, warm smile to the lobby receptionist, completely unaware of the storm waiting upstairs. Her newfound peace was shattered the moment the elevator doors opened on the executive floor. A nervous assistant intercepted her, silently handing over a thick envelope sealed with the crest of the board of directors. The blow came formally, and it came without warning. Evelyn retreated to her office and broke the seal. It was a formal complaint from Marcus Thorne, alleging she had entered into an inappropriate personal relationship with a project advisor. He claimed she had compromised the firm's judgment. And to prove it, he attached the photographs. The images did exactly what Marcus intended. To anyone looking for the worst, they were completely damning. They showed a young CEO and an older man alone after hours, their body language unguarded and undeniably intimate. An emergency board hearing had been convened. Evelyn stared at the notice, her hands trembling slightly against the mahogany desk. The cruelest part was not losing her position. It was that Marcus had taken the most honest, vulnerable night of her life and twisted it into a crime. Julian learned of the emergency hearing the very same day. A corporate messenger delivered the sealed notice directly to his print shop. He read the allegations in silence. And for the first time since the lobby incident, his unshakable calm completely shattered. He understood instantly what had happened. He was the lever Marcus Thorne had used to pry her from her chair. He had asked Arthur Sterling for exactly one thing in exchange for his help: to stay entirely out of the company's politics. But the politics had reached past him anyway, seizing the woman beside him. The heavy guilt of that realization landed harder than any insult ever could. Later that afternoon, the bell above the shop door chimed. Evelyn walked in, dressed not in her expensive armor, but in simple, muted clothes. Julian looked at her. The toll the fabricated scandal had taken on her was visible in the tired lines around her eyes. "I am sorry," Julian said, his voice thick with regret. "My presence here gave him the weapon he needed." Evelyn slowly shook her head. "Marcus didn't need you to break me," she replied quietly. "He just needed an excuse." They stood together in the quiet, dusty shop, two guarded people bracing for the brutal corporate trial that awaited them in the morning. The hearing was held the next morning in the main boardroom on the upper floor of Sterling Tower. The bitter irony was not lost on either of them. The trial was taking place under the exact lighting Julian had calculated decades earlier. Evelyn walked into the room entirely alone, wearing the sharpest corporate armor she owned. She faced a long table of directors who had never fully trusted her, and who now held a manufactured reason to finally be rid of her. Marcus Thorne stood at the head of the table to present his case.
Restructuring as outlined in this document.
He spoke with the practiced, heavy regret of a man merely performing his duty for the good of the company. He spoke of the firm's fragile reputation and the delicate confidence of the investors, using the very vocabulary he had taught her. Then, he slid the folder of photographs across the polished glass table. He did not need to raise his voice. He had molded the room's mindset for months, and now he simply collected the harvest. The heavy gaze of the board turned entirely to Evelyn. Slowly, she stood up to face them. Evelyn stood before the board. The room was dead silent, bracing for a panicked, defensive corporate spin. But when it was her turn to speak, she did something the directors did not expect.
The situation is entirely manageable.
She did not hide behind excuses. Instead, she named the incident in the lobby herself, before any director could weaponize it. She owned her flaw fully. I judged a man by his clothing in front of this entire company, she told them clearly. It was the worst thing I have ever done as your CEO, and I am not too proud to say it aloud. That stark honesty immediately disarmed the directors. Several shifted in their seats, suddenly uncertain of the story they had been handed. However, on the fabricated charge of the photographs, Evelyn did not bend a single inch. She looked down at the glossy images, stating plainly that they showed nothing more than two colleagues working late on a difficult assignment. She stared down the table, utterly refusing to bow her head to a lie, no matter how convincingly it had been arranged. Marcus watched her defiance with a private smile. He knew from 19 years of experience that in this room, the mere appearance of guilt was always enough. Marcus smoothly capitalized on the board's lingering doubts. He leaned forward, softly suggesting that a vote of no confidence was the only way to protect the firm's stock. Several senior directors nodded in reluctant agreement. Evelyn's honesty had moved them, but the fear of a public scandal outweighed their sudden respect for her courage. Evelyn stood her ground, refusing to show the despair threatening to pull her under. She watched her years of relentless, flawless work being dismantled by a single lie. Marcus prepared to call for the final vote, his eyes gleaming with the quiet triumph of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. Then, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the boardroom swung open. The sharp, rhythmic tap of a wooden cane echoed across the glass table. Chairman Arthur Sterling stepped into the room. He was not on the agenda, and his sudden presence immediately drained the smug confidence from Marcus's face. Arthur did not look at Evelyn, nor did he look at the nervous directors. His sharp, piercing gaze was locked entirely on his chief operating officer. He walked slowly to the head of the table, the room holding its collective breath. He tossed a thick, unmarked black folder directly in front of Marcus. "The complaint before you," Arthur announced, his voice vibrating with absolute, cold authority, "is not exactly what it appears to be." The entire board leaned in. Evelyn watched in stunned silence as the old chairman stood tall, preparing to completely rearrange the hierarchy of the room. Arthur Sterling stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding absolute silence from the wealthy directors. He opened the unmarked black folder. Inside were not photographs, but months of meticulous financial and internal communication records. "I have been conducting a quiet inquiry into this division for over a year," Arthur stated smoothly, his eyes fixed on Marcus. He systematically laid out the trail of Marcus's maneuvering, the engineered conflicts, the manufactured leverage, the corporate sabotage. The board members, previously eager to condemn Evelyn, now stared in horrified realization at the chief operating officer. "The photographs you were shown," Arthur continued, "are nothing but a night of honest work twisted into a desperate weapon." Marcus Thorne's perfectly crafted facade crumbled entirely. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but the room's hostility had already shifted. "You decided this firm belonged to you," Arthur told him coldly. "It never did. You are suspended, effective immediately." 19 years of calculated corporate climbing collapsed in a single sentence. Marcus gathered his things with shaking hands. He walked out of the heavy boardroom doors in utter disgrace, leaving behind the chair he had so ruthlessly tried to steal. Evelyn should have felt profound triumph. The lie had been exposed, her title was safe, and the man who tried to ruin her was gone. Yet, as the board members slowly filed out of the room, offering quiet apologies, she remained sitting at the long glass table. The victory felt strangely hollow. She realized that keeping her power did not magically erase the ugly truth of what she had done. She walked over to the expansive glass wall, looking far down at the bustling, marble-floored lobby of Sterling Tower. For a year, she had walked through that space seeing only a stage, a grand backdrop meant to elevate her own meticulously crafted image. Now, looking through Julian's eyes, she finally noticed the true brilliance of the architecture. The light fell perfectly, softening the sharp edges. The grand entrance was intentionally designed to draw people in without intimidating them, making anyone, regardless of wealth, feel significant. He had built the tower to completely dissolve the distance between the powerful and the powerless. And she had stood in the very center of his masterpiece and cruelly told its creator that he did not belong. The deepest failure of her life was not the boardroom trial. It was the simple, devastating act of weighing a human being by his clothes. Later that week, Evelyn returned to the waterfront field office. She no longer wore the sharp, intimidating suits of the boardroom. She raised the subject with Julian one afternoon, standing together over the massive, sprawling harbor drawings. She told him she finally understood what Sterling Tower was built for.
It's not just concrete and steel, it's a vision realized.
She admitted that he had not designed it to display corporate power, but to completely dissolve the distance between people. That's what it was supposed to do, Julian replied calmly. Whether it still does depends entirely on who is standing in the lobby. He did not say it as an accusation. He stated it as a simple, unyielding fact, and she silently accepted it as one. In the weeks that followed the hearing, Julian kept his physical and emotional distance from her. He had seen too many corporate promises broken. He quietly expected her to slip back into her old, aggressive habits. But Evelyn accepted his distance. The old version of her would have managed him, trying to find a psychological lever to turn his silence into approval. Instead, she simply kept showing up to the work, letting her daily conduct speak in place of any rehearsed corporate persuasion. The harbor project consumed Evelyn in a way no previous assignment ever had. She practically abandoned the glass tower, spending her days entirely at the muddy waterfront construction site. She traded her sharp designer heels for practical, dust-covered work boots, walking the site with the engineering crews. She took the time to learn the names of the laborers restoring the brickwork, addressing them with quiet, genuine respect. In technical meetings she would have once arrogantly delegated, she now sat patiently, listening far more than she spoke. Her entire leadership style had transformed. She no longer ruled through fear, speed, or intimidating silence. The division employees noticed the profound shift. The pervasive anxiety that used to follow her was replaced by a solid, earned loyalty. Julian watched this steady, unglamorous transformation from a distance, his initial skepticism slowly eroding. He witnessed her fiercely defending the public walkways against wealthy investors who still wanted the harbor sealed off.
Not just the wealthy few.
She used the exact arguments he had given her on that vulnerable night. Julian finally realized her change was not a performance, but a true rebirth. The months turned into a full year. Under their guided hands, the historic harbor district was finally complete. The old warehouses had been beautifully preserved, their original brick and heavy timber kept honest and exposed. The waterfront was deliberately left open, ensuring that anyone in the city could walk it freely, regardless of their wealth. It became, almost immediately, the most loved public space the city had seen in a generation. Even the investors who had initially demanded exclusivity found, to their surprise, that an open, vibrant harbor was worth far more. Through it all, Evelyn and Julian worked side by side, their earlier hostility entirely replaced by a seamless partnership. They navigated the site not as a powerful CEO and a subordinate, but as true equals sharing a singular, grounded vision. The electric, guarded tension of the past had softened into a deep, unspoken bond, a quiet, absolute reliance on one another.
Welcome
The day of the
everyone
grand
to the
opening
grand
arrived.
reopening of the Harbor
It was a
Square.
clear,
It is
crisp
a
winter
beautiful day
afternoon,
to celebrate
bathed in
this
bright
achievement.
sunlight. A modest ceremony was arranged on the cobblestone, gathering elite executives, rugged dock workers, and everyday citizens in the exact same space. Arthur Sterling spoke briefly, leaning on his cane. He looked out at the diverse crowd, expressing profound pride in the restored waterfront. Then, Evelyn took the small wooden platform.
But the rules were
She stood
designed
before
to
the
hold us
gathering
back.
and did something the company had
Not
never
anymore.
seen her do.
We are
She
committed
thanked
to
Julian Vance by
transparency,
name in
and
front
this
of
merger
everyone.
represents a significant
The press
step
cameras
forward for
flashed,
both our
but she no longer
organizations
cared
and
about the perfect
community.
image.
The truth
She did
is,
not
I was
offer a
scared.
standard corporate
We built this
recitation of
company
his
on
architectural
openness, and
genius.
lately I haven't been open with
Instead,
you. I
she
regret
spoke
that more than I
candidly
can
of her
say.
own flaws.
I
She
stand
told the
before you
crowd that
today
she had
humbled.
arrived at the company believing
My past
respect was
arrogance
protected by
clouded my
keeping people
judgment,
firmly
and for
beneath her.
that, I am truly sorry.
This is the
One man
moment
showed
everything
me,
changes.
without ever raising his
won't
voice,
pretend
how completely
anymore.
wrong I
I am
was,
finally
she
ready
declared,
to face
her
the
voice
truth.
steady and clear.
Your
He designed
unwavering
this harbor,
dedication
she
to this
said,
community
but the
set
more
a
important
course
thing
for
he
all of
built
us
this
to
year was the
follow.
person standing in
We
front
will
of you.
carry your legacy forward.
Julian stood at the very edge of the crowd, exactly where he had asked to be, safely hidden from the photographs. He did not smile in the way the cameras would have wanted, but a long, heavy weariness finally eased from his face. Evelyn gave him the ultimate respect, she did not point him out. Across the cheering crowd, a silent, profound understanding passed between them. The grand opening ceremony eventually concluded, and the wealthy elite retreated to their high-rise glass towers. As dusk fell over the harbor, Evelyn walked away from the lingering celebration, heading toward the quiet brick field office. Inside, the massive drafting tables were already bare. Julian was quietly packing his pencils and rolled blueprints into his worn leather case. He was a man who built things and moved on. The harbor was finished, and so was his time at Sterling Dominion. Evelyn stood in the doorway, watching him. A year ago, she would have aggressively negotiated to keep his talent on the payroll. Now, she understood that trying to cage him in a corporate boardroom would destroy the very thing she respected about him. "You're really leaving," she said softly, stepping into the warm, dim light of the office.
The light doesn't make it any easier.
Julian snapped the brass buckles of his case shut. "The concrete is poured, Evelyn. The foundation is set." He looked at her, his eyes conveying a deep, respectful finality. "The rest is up to the people who live in it." He wasn't just talking about the brick and timber of the harbor.
I merely helped you
He was
find who
talking
you were
about her.
always meant to be.
Julian picked up his heavy leather case. There was no dramatic farewell, just the quiet understanding of two equals. He walked past her toward the doorway, stopping for just a fraction of a second to offer a single, respectful nod. Evelyn returned the nod, letting him walk out into the cold evening air without a single word of corporate protest. She watched from the large office window as his silhouette dissolved into the lively, diverse crowd of the harbor he had revived. He was gone, fading back into the quiet, unbothered life he preferred, leaving behind a legacy carved in brick and stone. The next morning, Evelyn returned to the towering glass heights of Sterling Tower. As she walked across the grand marble lobby, she saw the immense space entirely differently. It was no longer a stage for her ego. She greeted the staff, the security guards, the receptionists, not as invisible background fixtures, but with genuine, warm eye contact. When she entered the executive boardroom, the remaining directors looked at her with a new, quiet reverence. She took her seat at the head of the glass table, ready to lead the company on the solid foundation Julian had left her. The shift in Sterling Dominion's culture did not happen overnight, but Evelyn's new direction was unmistakable. She began systematically dismantling the cutthroat, toxic infrastructure that Marcus Thorne had spent decades building. In the
blueprints
boardroom,
represent
she presented a
fundamental
radical
shift.
new
We are
portfolio.
prioritizing sustainable
The focus
community
was no
development
longer
over the
strictly on
previous
luxury high-rises and
model.
exclusive commercial zones.
See how
She
the library
proposed massive
connects
investments
directly
in
to the main
public
space here.
infrastructure,
It's beautifully
libraries,
integrated.
parks,
The
and community
center
centers
layout
designed
is
to
also
bridge the
very
city's
strong.
divides. The older directors were initially skeptical, fearing a sudden drop in their precious quarterly profit margins. But Arthur Sterling backed her completely, his steady presence silencing any remaining whispers of dissent. To their surprise, Evelyn's strategy proved
The
brilliant.
minister is visiting next week
The
to see
profound public
progress.
goodwill generated by the harbor project brought in unprecedented municipal contracts. Sterling
I
Dominion
want
was
to
no
thank the
longer
city
seen as a
for their
predatory
partnership.
conglomerate,
We look
but as an
forward to a very
integral,
successful
respected
future
pillar of
together.
the city's future. Evelyn was busier than ever, navigating the endless complexities of urban development and ethical corporate management. Yet, despite the grueling hours, she had never felt so entirely at peace with the reflection she saw in the glass. 2 years passed. Sterling Dominion continued to thrive, its skyline projects now balanced by vast, accessible public spaces. In the quiet of his private office, Arthur Sterling signed his final document. The old chairman was finally stepping down. He handed the full control of the company to Evelyn, not because she was ruthless, but because she had learned how not to be. She accepted the chairmanship with quiet grace, fully aware of the heavy, human responsibility the title carried. On her first free weekend as chairman, Evelyn did not celebrate with high society galas or expensive champagne. Instead, she put on a simple woolen coat and walked down to the historic harbor district alone. The waterfront was bustling with life, completely indifferent to the corporate titles of the people walking its cobblestones. As she walked near the water's edge, she spotted a familiar figure sitting quietly on a wooden public bench. It was Julian. He was sketching in a small, worn notebook, blending perfectly into the vibrant life of the space he had built. Evelyn did not rush forward to manage the interaction. She simply stopped and watched him, allowing a profound, peaceful smile to touch her lips. Evelyn slowly crossed the cobblestone path, her footsteps light and unhurried. Julian heard her approach. He did not stiffen or retreat into his usual guarded posture. He calmly closed his worn sketchbook, leaving his rough hand resting gently on the leather cover. Without asking for permission or offering a formal greeting, Evelyn took a seat on the wooden bench beside him. They did not speak of boardrooms, profit margins, or corporate legacy. Instead, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the lively, diverse crowd move freely through the space they had protected. The setting sun cast a warm, golden glow over the harbor, softening the sharp lines of the historic brick warehouses. In the far distance, Sterling Tower caught the last light of the day, standing tall but no longer casting a cold shadow over her life. Evelyn had finally learned that true authority was never about how high one could climb to look down at others. True power was simply having the courage to build a foundation where everyone, including oneself, finally belonged.